Officer Mitch Donovan sat in his patrol car, the engine idling, as he watched the streets of a predominantly black neighborhood. The mid-afternoon sun beat down on the cracked sidewalks of Bridgeport, casting long shadows across the weathered storefronts. From where he was parked, he could see the usual activity: kids playing with makeshift toys, older men lounging on stoops, and a few pedestrians shuffling in and out of corner shops. For most, it was a normal day, but not for Mitch. He took the last bite of his sandwich, washed it down with a gulp of lukewarm coffee, and tossed the wrapper into the back seat. His eyes flickered across the scene, and a deep-rooted bias tugged at his thoughts. To him, this neighborhood always felt like a ticking time bomb. He didn't need to see any actual trouble to suspect something. It was in the air, in the way people moved at least. That's what he told himself. Mitch leaned back in his seat, narrowing his eyes at a group of teenagers who had gathered near the corner of the street. They were laughing and playing basketball, but to Mitch, their carefree attitude was suspicious. They're just waiting for the right moment to start something, he muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He had been on this beat long enough to know how things worked around here, or at least, that's what he believed. His radio crackled, but there was no real urgency in the dispatch calls. Still, Mitch was restless. His ingrained bias wasn't the overt kind. He wasn't the type to spout racial slurs or explicitly express hatred. No, Mitch was more subtle in his prejudices, quick to assume guilt, always on edge when a black face crossed his path, and perpetually suspecting trouble where none existed. It was an unspoken code he operated by, a shadow that loomed behind every interaction in neighborhoods like this one. As he took another sip of his now cold coffee, a small commotion caught his attention. A man was exiting the cafe across the street, and Mitch's gaze locked onto him with laser precision. The man who stepped out of the cafe was tall, sharply dressed in a dark tailored suit, and carried himself with a confidence that instantly irritated Mitch. His clean-cut appearance didn't fit with the typical image Mitch had of the people in this neighborhood. The man's polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he crossed the street, his head held high, unaware or perhaps unconcerned by the attention he was drawing. Unbeknownst to Mitch, this was Darius Johnson, the newly promoted captain of the very precinct Mitch worked for. Darius had spent several years working in a different city, but he had grown up in Bridgeport. His return to the city as a captain was a homecoming of sorts, though Mitch, sitting in his patrol car, knew none of this. To Mitch, all he saw was a black man in a suit walking through a part of town where, in his mind, no one should look that put together unless they were trying to act like they were better than everyone else. Who the hell does he think he is? Mitch mumbled to himself as he continued to watch Darius from behind the steering wheel. His gaze narrowed with suspicion. Mitch had seen plenty of guys like him clean-cut on the outside, but in his eyes that often meant trouble was brewing on the inside. The idea that Darius might just be going about his day didn't even cross Mitch's mind. As Darius approached the crosswalk, Mitch's grip on the wheel tightened. He was already making assumptions, drawing conclusions about the man without any actual reason. It was automatic, like flipping a switch. Mitch didn't even realize he was profiling Darius based solely on his race. It was second nature to him. It was how he had operated for years, how he had been trained to see the world around him. Darius walked confidently, checking his phone as he waited for the light to change. He had a sense of purpose about him. But Mitch interpreted it as arrogance. A small voice in the back of Mitch's mind whispered, "What's this guy up to?" The thought was born of prejudice, not evidence, but Mitch didn't question it. His years on the force had taught him to always be suspicious, especially in this part of town, and especially of black men who didn't fit the mold he expected. The light changed and Darius began to cross the street. As he walked, the afternoon sunlight glinted off his suit jacket, and for a moment, Mitch hesitated. Something about the man's confidence, his calmness, made Mitch uneasy. It was the kind of confidence Mitch felt he should be in control of, not the other way around. A flicker of resentment sparked inside him. Mitch opened his car door, slamming it shut with more force than necessary. His boots clomped against the pavement as he stepped out, his eyes locked onto Darius like a predator zeroing in on its prey. "Hey, you." Mitch's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. He marched toward Darius with an irritated expression, his hand resting on his belt, close to his radio. Darius stopped mid-stride, turning slowly to face the officer approaching him. His expression remained neutral, calm, but there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Yes, officer," Darius replied, his tone measured and respectful, though there was a subtle edge of curiosity. He wasn't used to being stopped for simply walking down the street, but he had encountered enough in his life to recognize what was happening. Darius had seen this play out before, different cities, different uniforms, but the same undercurrent of racial profiling. Mitch stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. "What are you doing around here?" he barked, his tone harsh and laced with suspicion. There was no greeting, no pretense of politeness. Mitch's body language made it clear that he saw Darius as a potential threat, not a citizen deserving of respect. Darius tilted his head slightly, considering the question. He could feel the eyes of passing pedestrians glancing their way, some lingering longer than others, curious but hesitant. The tension was palpable. "I'm on my way to a meeting," Darius replied calmly, his eyes steady on Mitch's face. There was no anger in his voice, no trace of defensiveness, just a quiet strength that unsettled Mitch even more. But Mitch wasn't interested in the answer. His mind was already racing with unfounded suspicions. "You look like you're up to no good," he sneered, stepping even closer as if trying to provoke a reaction. His hand hovered near his badge, a subconscious reminder to himself of the power he thought it gave him. Darius, still composed, didn't flinch. Instead, he stood his ground, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a challenge, but the authority in his tone was undeniable. For a split second, Mitch hesitated. There was something about this man, something in the way he carried himself that made Mitch uncomfortable. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a deep-seated irritation that came from years of dealing with people he believed didn't respect his authority. And in that moment, Mitch decided that this man, whoever he was, needed to be put in his place. "Got any ID on you?" Mitch demanded, his voice growing harsher. He wasn't asking, he was ordering. The gap between a routine question and an intimidation tactic was razor thin, and Mitch had just crossed it. Darius reached into his jacket slowly, making sure to move deliberately. He had been through situations like this before, and he knew that sudden movements could escalate things in dangerous ways. "I'm happy to show you my ID, officer," he said, keeping his tone even. But before Darius could pull out his wallet, Mitch's temper flared. His bias, his need for control, and the arrogance that came with the badge boiled over. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Mitch growled, grabbing Darius by the arm with more force than necessary. The move was meant to assert dominance, but in that instant, Mitch had crossed a line he would soon regret crossing. The sun glinted off the windshield of Officer Mitch Donovan's patrol car as he finished his lunch break, his gaze drifting over the familiar surroundings of the neighborhood. It was a predominantly black area of the city, and Mitch had patrolled these streets for years, his biases growing like weeds in the cracks of his worldview. He prided himself on keeping order, but his version of order was skewed by the stereotypes he carried deep within him. The very presence of a black person was enough to make him suspicious, even if they were just walking down the street. It was an unspoken bias, one he would never admit to, but it tainted every interaction he had in this part of town. As Mitch took a final sip of his coffee, his eyes landed on a tall, well-dressed black man exiting the corner cafe. The man walked with a confident stride, his sharp suit catching the late afternoon light. Something about the way he carried himself, his posture, his air of self-assurance, rubbed Mitch the wrong way. He narrowed his eyes, feeling a flicker of irritation flare up inside him. "What's this guy doing here?" Mitch muttered to himself, his fingers tapping restlessly on the steering wheel. There was no obvious reason for suspicion, no crime being committed, no law being broken. But Mitch's ingrained prejudices had already painted the man in a negative light. A black man dressed like that, in this neighborhood, had to be up to something. His irritation grew with every step the man took toward the crosswalk. Mitch's mind spun with assumptions, each one reinforcing the other. Out of place. What's he got to prove? Showing off, thinking he's better than the rest around here. The whispers of these thoughts rattled in Mitch's brain, growing louder with each passing second. He convinced himself that something was wrong, even though the only thing that stood out was the man's confidence. Mitch had seen men like him before, people who acted like they didn't belong in the space he thought he controlled. That suit, that posture, it's like he's asking for trouble. His sense of authority, bolstered by the badge on his chest, was ignited by the sight, and like a match to dry kindling, his bias flared into determination. He couldn't let this man walk by without questioning him. The feeling was instinctual, bred from years of unchecked power and silent prejudice. Without fully realizing it, Mitch had already made up his mind. This man didn't belong, and he was going to make sure of it. He opened the door of his patrol car with purpose, the heavy thud of his boots hitting the pavement. His muscles tensed with the familiar sense of control that came with confronting someone he deemed suspicious. His hand hovered near his belt as he strode across the street, his eyes locked on the man approaching the crosswalk. I'll teach him a lesson, Mitch thought. I'll remind him who's in charge here. Darius Johnson didn't notice Mitch at first. He was focused on his phone, glancing at a message about his upcoming meeting. He had just returned to the city after years away, and today was important. The precinct had undergone several changes, and he was ready to bring more. He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who had worked hard for everything he had. A man who understood the weight of his position and the significance of his return to his hometown. But Mitch didn't see any of that. All he saw was a black man walking in his territory. "Hey." Mitch's voice cut through the afternoon air like a whip, sharp and filled with the authority he believed he had. Darius looked up, surprised by the harshness of the tone. Mitch stepped directly in front of him, blocking his path with deliberate aggression. His posture screamed intimidation, shoulders squared, legs planted wide apart. The look in his eyes was anything but welcoming. "Yeah, you," Mitch barked, his tone dripping with condescension. "What are you doing around here?" Darius took a moment to assess the situation, the calm in his demeanor unwavering. He had dealt with situations like this before. Many times, though it had been years since anyone had questioned him so blatantly. His calm gaze met Mitch's, but he could feel the undercurrent of what was really happening. This wasn't just about why he was walking down the street, this was about who he was, and what Mitch thought that meant. "I'm just on my way to a meeting," Darius replied evenly, his voice measured, controlled. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give this officer any reason to escalate the situation. But Mitch wasn't interested in the answer. He had already decided who Darius was the moment he saw him. He stepped closer, his face inches from Darius's, the stench of coffee and entitlement wafting between them. His hand rested on his belt, fingers twitching near his holster, as if ready to make a move. "You look like you're up to no good," Mitch sneered, his words laced with thinly veiled accusations. "Walking around here, dressed like that. Got any ID?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The racial undertones were clear. Mitch wasn't asking for ID because he genuinely believed there was a reason to. He was asking because in his mind a black man in a suit was out of place, suspicious, someone who needed to be checked, controlled. Darius held his ground, his face composed but his heart beating a little faster. He had encountered men like Mitch before, officers who wore their bias on their sleeves, masked as authority. He had learned over the years that losing his temper wouldn't help, that staying calm was his best defense. "Of course, officer," Darius said, reaching into his jacket slowly, deliberately making sure his movements were slow and clear. "I'm happy to show you my ID." But before he could even pull out his wallet, Mitch's irritation boiled over. The fact that Darius wasn't intimidated, that he hadn't flinched, only fueled Mitch's anger. He wanted to see fear in this man's eyes, and the lack of it was infuriating. "You think you can talk to me like you're some big shot?" Mitch growled, stepping even closer, his voice rising. His hand shot out, grabbing Darius by the arm with a roughness that jolted Darius, but he didn't react. Not yet. Darius looked down at Mitch's hand gripping his arm and back up at the officer, his calm demeanor unshaken, but now there was something else in his eyes, a warning. "Officer," Darius said quietly, his voice firm but measured. "Let go of my arm." The calm command in Darius's voice only pushed Mitch further over the edge. He was used to people complying, to fear and submission. But here was this black man, in a suit, talking to him like he wasn't the one in control. It was more than Mitch could handle. Before Darius could react, Mitch swung his fist, punching him square in the face. The force of the blow sent Darius stumbling back, but he didn't fall. He caught himself standing tall, one hand raised to his cheek where the officer's fist had landed. A few pedestrians had stopped, watching the scene unfold in shock, but no one moved. They stood frozen, unsure of what to do, as the tension in the air thickened. Mitch smirked, clearly feeling justified in his actions, as if he had somehow proven his point. "Maybe now you'll earn some respect," he sneered. Darius straightened, his hand dropping from his face. His eyes were no longer calm, they were filled with authority, the weight of his position clear in the way he stood. The smirk on Mitch's face faltered as he saw the shift in Darius's expression. "You just made a big mistake," Darius said slowly, his voice steady but laced with something cold and hard. Mitch blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "Oh yeah," he scoffed, though his confidence was beginning to crack. "And what mistake is that, buddy?" Darius didn't blink. "I'm Captain Darius Johnson," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "The new captain of this precinct." The color drained from Mitch's face. It was a hot, suffocating afternoon, the kind that seemed to make the city streets shimmer with tension. Mitch Donovan stood rigid, the sweat rolling down his neck as he zeroed in on Darius Johnson. His eyes burned with suspicion, narrowing at the sight of a confident black man walking in a suit that seemed too expensive, too clean, too out of place. Mitch's hand rested on his belt, fingers grazing his holster like he was already preparing for trouble. "Hey!" Mitch barked, taking a step forward, blocking Darius's path. "What are you doing around here?" Darius stopped, meeting Mitch's gaze with calm, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a knowing exhaustion, like he had seen this scene play out far too many times before. "I'm just on my way to a meeting," Darius replied, his tone respectful but firm. He didn't flinch under Mitch's stare, didn't back down like others might have. Mitch's lip curled in a sneer, a reflex born from years of unchecked authority. "A meeting," he repeated, disbelief thick in his voice, as if the very idea that Darius could be anything but trouble was absurd. "You look like you're up to no good." Darius sighed, his patience worn thin but still intact. He wasn't about to let this cop drag him into a scene. "Officer, I'm just passing through. There's no need for this." But Mitch wasn't listening. His mind was already racing, paranoia feeding into his deeply rooted bias. How many times had he seen men like Darius Black, confident, walking with their heads held high, and assumed they were hiding something? His gaze flickered over Darius, searching for a reason, any reason, to justify what he was about to do. "You got any ID?" Mitch demanded, his voice hard, accusatory. His stance shifted, becoming more aggressive, as if daring Darius to resist. Darius nodded slowly, knowing all too well where this was going. He had dealt with men like Mitch before, cops who saw his skin color as a threat, who treated every black man they encountered like a criminal. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to give Mitch any excuse to escalate the situation further. "I have my ID right here," Darius said, reaching into his jacket. But Mitch's paranoia spiked, his mind leaping to the worst possible conclusion. The sight of Darius's hand moving towards his jacket was enough to set him off, a surge of irrational fear flooding his veins. "What, you think you're above the law?" Mitch snarled, stepping closer, his hand twitching near his gun. "You think you can just walk around here, acting like you own the place?" Darius's hand froze halfway to his wallet, his patience finally wearing thin. He could feel the tension building, the situation spiraling out of control, but he kept his voice calm, controlled. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble, officer. I'm just reaching for my ID like you asked." But Mitch didn't hear him. He didn't want to. In his mind, Darius was already guilty of what he wasn't sure, but guilty nonetheless. His grip on his belt tightened, his knuckles white with the pressure. "Don't act like you're better than the rest of them," Mitch spat, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. "You people always think you can talk your way out of things." Darius clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain composed. He knew that if he gave Mitch any reason to act on his prejudice, things would only get worse. "I'm just following your orders," Darius said evenly, his hand still poised just inches from his wallet. But to Mitch, Darius's calm only fed into his delusion. How dare this black man speak to him with such composure, as if they were equals? The thought burned in Mitch's mind, his anger twisting into something darker, more dangerous. And then, in a split second, Mitch snapped. His hand shot out, grabbing Darius by the arm with a roughness that made Darius stumble slightly. Before Darius could even react, Mitch swung his fist, a sickening crunch of knuckles against flesh echoing in the quiet street. The punch landed square on Darius's face, sending him reeling backwards, blood trickling from his lip. The world seemed to freeze for a moment, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air like a thick fog. The few bystanders on the street stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with shock, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Darius raised a hand to his cheek, the sting of the punch radiating through his skin. He stared at Mitch, his mind racing to comprehend the full weight of the situation. This wasn't just a punch. This was an assault, a racially motivated attack that carried with it the weight of centuries of oppression, the echoes of every black man who had been beaten down for daring to walk with his head held high. Mitch stood there, chest heaving, his face twisted with rage and self-righteousness. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," he sneered, his voice low, dripping with the kind of superiority that had been passed down through generations of systemic racism. Darius didn't move. He could feel the eyes of the onlookers on him, could sense the shift in the air as the gravity of the moment settled over them all. For a split second, he considered retaliating, fighting back, showing Mitch that he wasn't just another black man who would take this kind of abuse lying down. But he knew that if he did, it would only play into Mitch's hands. Instead, he straightened, his body aching from the blow but his resolve unshaken. He looked Mitch square in the eyes, his expression calm but burning with a quiet, unyielding fury. "You just made a big mistake, officer," Darius said, his voice steady but filled with the kind of authority that made even the most hardened men stop in their tracks. Mitch blinked, the arrogance in his eyes faltering for the first time. "What?" he stammered, his voice wavering slightly. "What are you talking about?" Darius didn't answer right away. Instead, He slowly reached into his jacket once again, this time pulling out a badge. He held it up for Mitch to see, letting the realization sink in. "I'm Captain Darius Johnson," he said, his voice cold and precise. "The new captain of this precinct." The color drained from Mitch's face as the words hit him like a freight train. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He had just punched his new superior officer, a black man, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation settled heavily between them, and Mitch's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of what he had done crashed over him. "I'm pressing charges," Darius said quietly, slipping his badge back into his jacket. "And you're going to answer for this." Mitch's breath hitched in his throat. The world around him seemed to spin as he realized that everything, his career, his reputation, his power, was slipping through his fingers. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and there would be no saving himself this time. Behind them, the murmurs of the bystanders grew louder, their phones raised, recording every second of the exchange. Mitch's stomach churned as the cold, hard truth hit him. This wasn't just going to ruin him in the precinct. This was going to ruin him everywhere. Social media, the news, it would be all over by morning. And Darius was still standing tall, the blood on his lip a stark reminder of what Mitch had done, but there was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. As the sound of sirens filled the air, Mitch's knees buckled under the weight of his actions. There was no turning back now. The racial hostility he had allowed to fester inside him for years had finally destroyed everything. The sting of Mitch's punch still pulsed on Darius's cheek, but he stood tall, his body straightening, as though every ounce of pride within him refused to bow. Bruised but not broken, Darius adjusted his jacket, his hand moving deliberately to his side. His breathing remained controlled, even as the atmosphere between him and Mitch crackled with the aftermath of violence. Mitch, panting slightly, his hands still half clenched, hovered between satisfaction and discomfort. He hadn't expected this. Not this. He thought it would be another routine moment of intimidation, another instance where his badge, his power, and his whiteness granted him the upper hand. But something about Darius was different. The way he didn't cower. The calm in his eyes, even after the blow. Mitch's confidence started to wane, a sliver of doubt creeping into his thoughts. "What's the matter?" Mitch spat, a twisted grin forming on his face. "You gonna act tough now? You don't belong here, man. You should have kept your head down." Darius locked eyes with him, the air thickening with tension. His voice, when it finally came, was like a cold wind cutting through the heat of Mitch's arrogance. "You just made a big mistake," Darius said, his words low but weighted with certainty. Mitch froze, his brow furrowing. The sneer remained on his lips, but now there was something else behind it: uncertainty. "What you talking about?" Darius straightened, the pain in his face paling in comparison to the fire igniting inside him. He had fought too long, seen too much, to let one officer's prejudice bring him down. He took a step closer to Mitch, never breaking eye contact. "I'm Captain Darius Johnson," he said, his voice unwavering. "The new captain of your precinct." Mitch blinked, his smugness faltering, his expression turning from disbelief to shock. For a moment, the world around him seemed to blur, as if his mind couldn't process what Darius had just said. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, the gravity of his mistake sinking in with every heartbeat. You're the captain," Mitch stammered, his voice losing its edge, now tinged with panic. His face, once flushed with the thrill of exerting power, began to pale. "That's right," Darius continued, his tone cutting through Mitch's mounting fear. "And you just assaulted a superior officer." Mitch's heart thudded in his chest. The authority in Darius's voice wasn't just that of a man holding rank. It was the voice of someone who had endured, who had risen through systems designed to keep him down, and now held power in his own hands. Darius's words carried the weight of every injustice, every stereotype, every moment of bias that men like Mitch perpetuated. And Mitch, for the first time, saw it. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Darius didn't flinch, didn't blink. He held his ground, forcing Mitch to confront the reality of what he had done. Mitch's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, for some way to regain control. But it was too late. The superiority he had relied on crumbled beneath the force of Darius's quiet strength. "Captain, I didn't know," Mitch muttered, desperation creeping into his voice. "Doesn't matter," Darius replied, his tone sharper now. "You didn't care to know. You saw me and assumed the worst because of what I look like. That's the real issue, isn't it?" Mitch opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His grip on his power, his authority was slipping. He had made his move and now Darius was in control. Without breaking his gaze, Darius slowly pulled out his phone. The street had gone quiet, the usual hum of traffic and city life replaced by the whispers of bystanders who had stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. Pedestrians of different backgrounds gathered at a distance, their eyes fixed on the two men at the center of it all, one bruised but composed, the other shaken, his sense of dominance fractured. Darius dialed with steady fingers, his movements measured and precise. Mitch stood rooted to the spot, watching in disbelief as Darius calmly reported the assault. "Dispatch. This is Captain Darius Johnson," Darius said, his voice clear and firm. "I need a squad down at Maple Street and 5th Avenue. Officer Donovan has assaulted a superior officer. I'll be filing charges." The word assault echoed in the air, each syllable a reminder of Mitch's fall from power. A chill seemed to settle over him, his arrogance dissipating, replaced by a gnawing dread. As Darius spoke, some of the bystanders began murmuring among themselves. A black man, leaning against the wall of a nearby store, shook his head and muttered, "This always happens around here." His voice carried the weight of lived experience, the resignation of someone who had seen this kind of racial profiling play out too many times. A group of young black women, phones in hand, stood a few feet away, recording the scene. They whispered to each other, their faces reflecting a mix of concern and frustration. "Look at him," one of them said, nodding towards Mitch. "He thought he could just get away with it." "Yeah, but not today," another replied. "Not with all of us watching." Their phones captured not just the moment Mitch's actions caught up to him, but the broader context of a community long subjected to similar abuses. For them, this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, unspoken narrative of racial injustice, a story that had played out countless times before in different forms, with different faces. Across the street, an older Latina woman stood with her arms crossed, her face tight with anger. "I've seen this too many times," she said to no one in particular, her voice thick with emotion. "They think they can do whatever they want in our neighborhoods." Nearby, a white couple exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. They stayed silent, unsure of how to react. Their discomfort, though quiet, added another layer to the scene, a reminder that the effects of systemic racism were often invisible to those who didn't experience it firsthand. Mitch, meanwhile, could feel the weight of the stares on him. He glanced around, noticing for the first time the cameras, the murmurs, the collective judgment hanging in the air. He had been so used to getting away with his actions, so confident that his badge and position would shield him. But now, under the harsh light of public scrutiny, that shield was cracking. Darius finished his call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, standing tall amidst the growing crowd. The power dynamic had shifted, and Mitch knew it. The people watching weren't just onlookers, they were witnesses to the unraveling of his authority. The wail of sirens in the distance grew louder, a signal that reinforcements were on their way. For Mitch, each second dragged like an eternity. He wasn't just facing Darius anymore. He was facing the community, the cameras, the collective anger of those who had been on the receiving end of officers like him. When the squad cars arrived, the tension snapped into focus. Officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene, confused at first by the sight of their colleague standing pale and shaken, and the black man standing tall before him. Lieutenant Sandra Ruiz was the first to approach. Her face, normally unreadable, tightened as she took in the sight of Mitch's pale face and Darius's bruised cheek. "Captain Johnson," she said, nodding respectfully at Darius. Her eyes flicked over to Mitch, narrowing slightly as she pieced together the situation. "I'm pressing charges," Darius said firmly. "Officer Donovan assaulted me without provocation." Lieutenant Ruiz's jaw clenched. She had seen the patterns before, the ways in which officers like Mitch abused their authority, especially in neighborhoods like this one. But she had never seen it unfold like this. She turned to Mitch, her voice sharp and cold. "Is this true, Officer Donovan?" Mitch stammered, the confidence completely drained from him. I didn't know he was the captain," he mumbled. Lieutenant Ruiz's face hardened. "Whether you knew or not doesn't matter," she said flatly. "You assaulted a superior officer." As Mitch's colleagues moved to handcuff him, the weight of his actions settled fully upon him. He had thought himself untouchable, a man above reproach. But now, as the cold metal of the cuffs dug into his wrists, he realized too late that he was just like any other criminal bound by the laws he thought he controlled. And all the while, the cameras kept rolling. The streets of Maple and Fifth Avenue buzzed with an uneasy energy. The air, thick with tension, pressed down on the bystanders who had witnessed the shocking scene unfold. Some clutched their phones, still recording, while others murmured to each other in disbelief. The sound of distant sirens grew louder, echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. Moments later, 2 squad cars screeched to a halt at the scene. From the first vehicle, a mix of white and minority officers cautiously stepped out, their eyes scanning the situation before them. It was as though the very air between them held the unspoken reality of racial tensions that had simmered under the surface for years, now bubbling into the open. Each officer felt the weight of the moment. Lieutenant Sandra Ruiz, a Latina officer known for her no-nonsense demeanor, was the first to approach. The years had hardened her face, but today frustration flickered behind her sharp gaze. She had fought tirelessly against the subtle and overt racism in the department, always pushing for reforms, for accountability. Yet here she was again, staring down another instance of the exact thing she had tried to root out. As she walked closer, her eyes fell on Captain Darius Johnson, his suit rumpled from the altercation, but his posture firm. Across from him stood Officer Mitch Donovan, pale, sweat beading on his forehead, the cocky bravado from earlier now replaced by a growing fear. Ruiz knew Mitch well. She had worked alongside him for years and had seen his biases in action. Today, however, there was no hiding behind the badge. "Lieutenant Ruiz," Darius greeted her calmly, though his voice carried a quiet authority. The tension crackled in the air between them, heavy with the significance of what was about to happen. Ruiz nodded, her gaze flicking between Mitch and Darius. She could feel the eyes of her fellow officers on her, a mix of races, some sympathetic to the cause of justice, others uncomfortably aware of the silent prejudices they had ignored for far too long. "What's the situation, Captain?" Ruiz asked, already knowing where this was heading, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion from the constant battles she had fought against a system reluctant to change. Darius's eyes, still sharp and unwavering, met hers. "Officer Donovan has assaulted me, unprovoked," he stated firmly, each word a stone in the growing wall of accountability closing in on Mitch.
A murmur ran through the crowd as Ruiz took a step forward, her jaw tightening. The moment she had dreaded, the intersection of race, power, and accountability was happening in real time. Mitch stood frozen, his usual confidence shattered like glass. His mind raced, trying to piece together how a routine stop had spiraled into this. He had assaulted his new captain, a black man, and the power dynamic he had so often taken for granted had flipped.
"I didn't know." Mitch's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you were the captain." Lieutenant Ruiz's eyes locked onto Mitch, her frustration with him palpable. The words hung in the air like a flimsy excuse, and she wasn't having it. She had spent too many years hearing similar defenses from officers caught abusing their power, and this time she wasn't going to let it slide. "Whether he's the captain or not doesn't change what you did, Mitch," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The other officers, some white, some black, some Latino, all stood silently watching, their expressions betraying their discomfort. Darius kept his composure, standing tall despite the bruise forming on his face. His calm was unnerving to Mitch, who suddenly felt exposed. The realization began to sink in that this was no misunderstanding, no mistake he could brush under the rug. It was a choice he made, guided by years of unchecked racial bias. "The badge doesn't give you the right to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't," Ruiz continued, her tone firm. "You assaulted a superior officer, Mitch, but let's not pretend that's the real issue here. You assaulted him because you saw a black man in a suit and thought you could treat him like anyone else you've racially profiled." Mitch's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of her words bore down on him, the truth in them undeniable. He had felt untouchable behind the badge, but now, stripped of that false sense of power, he realized the grave mistake he had made. Darius watched, his eyes piercing through the discomfort in Mitch's silence. He had seen this happen too many times, people like Mitch, hiding behind authority, making judgments based on the color of someone's skin. Today, however, was different. Today there would be consequences. "I'll be pressing charges," Darius stated plainly, the calmness in his voice a stark contrast to the chaos that churned in Mitch's mind.
Ruiz turned to the other officers. "You heard him. This is no longer just about a breach of protocol. This is about holding each other accountable."
The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder. Some of them had seen this kind of abuse firsthand, felt the sting of being judged by their skin, and now they were witnessing the rarest of moments, justice taking shape in real time. The scene shifted as Lieutenant Ruiz gave the order. Two officers, one black, the other white, stepped forward to arrest Mitch. The sight was a powerful symbol. The racial dynamics that had long tilted in Mitch's favor were now turned against him. His white privilege, once a shield, now lay shattered as the reality of his actions caught up with him. As the officers approached, Mitch's world crumbled. These were men he had shared coffee breaks with, laughed with, men he had considered allies. But now their faces were hardened, professional. They weren't arresting their friend. They were arresting a criminal. The black officer, someone Mitch had always dismissed as just another minority in the department, moved with the same calculated precision he had seen in Mitch countless times. There was no sympathy in his eyes, just the cold detachment of someone doing his job. The white officer, someone Mitch had shared easy conversations with, didn't meet his gaze. There was no camaraderie left here. The silent approval Mitch had once relied on was gone, replaced by the weight of justice. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around Mitch's wrists, and for the first time in his career, he felt powerless. The badge he had used to shield his actions was now a distant memory. He was no longer Officer Mitch Donovan. He was a man who had let his racial biases lead him down a path of destruction. As the officers led him toward the squad car, the murmurs of the crowd followed him. He could hear them, black, Latino, and white voices alike, discussing what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered that Mitch got what he deserved. It didn't matter anymore. His reputation, his career, his sense of superiority, all gone. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to dissipate as Mitch was loaded into the car. But for Lieutenant Ruiz, Darius, and the onlookers, the deeper questions remained. Would this moment spark change, or would the system find a way to cover it up once again? Darius stood quietly, his hands behind his back, as the squad car pulled away. This wasn't just about him or Mitch. This was about the long fight against a system built on injustice. And today, for the first time in a long time, the scales had tipped ever so slightly toward the right side of history. Ruiz, feeling the weight of everything settle on her shoulders, looked over at Darius. "Handled by the book," she said, her voice softer now, but still laced with the steel resolve that had carried her through years of fighting for reform. Darius nodded, his expression unreadable. But deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The distant wail of sirens still echoed in the air as the squad car carrying Officer Mitch Donovan pulled away from the scene, its blue and red lights casting eerie shadows across the faces of the onlookers. The crowd had grown since the incident began. A mix of Black, Latino, and white pedestrians lined the street, their expressions reflecting a range of emotions: curiosity, satisfaction, disbelief, and a simmering anger that had been waiting for a moment like this. Officer Donovan sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists bound by the cold, unforgiving metal of handcuffs. He'd been in this car countless times before, but always in the front seat. Now, confined in the back like the many people of color he had unjustly profiled and detained, the reality of his actions and their consequences began to sink in. His badge, the symbol of authority that once made him feel invincible, now felt like a chain, dragging him deeper into a pit of guilt and shame. The voices outside grew louder, their murmurs buzzing through the cracked window. He could hear them, Black and Latino bystanders discussing the moment with a certain grim satisfaction. Finally, one of them gets what they deserve, a Black man muttered to his friend, their voices carrying through the heavy air. "How many times have we seen this go the other way?" "It's about time," a Latina woman added, shaking her head. "This could change things." Mitch's eyes darted between the faces, many of whom were now holding up phones, capturing his humiliation for the world to see. The pit in his stomach deepened. He could already imagine the headlines, the social media posts, the viral videos. There would be no escaping this. His career, his life, everything was crumbling. Darius Johnson stood tall, his face still carrying the calm yet determined expression he had held throughout the entire ordeal. His cheek throbbed where Mitch's punch had landed, but he showed no sign of weakness. This moment was about more than the assault, it was about something far bigger than the both of them. Lieutenant Sandra Ruiz approached, her face tight with a blend of professionalism and frustration. She, too, had witnessed years of systemic racism within the department. This, for her, wasn't just a rogue officer crossing a line, it was a culmination of years of unchecked behavior, a system that too often protected officers like Mitch while punishing those who dared to speak out. "Captain Johnson," she addressed him formally, though there was a shared understanding in her eyes that went beyond rank. "How do you want to proceed?" Darius's voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it, a demand for change that echoed through every word. "Handle this by the book, Lieutenant Ruiz. No favors, no shortcuts. Let's make sure justice is served properly, this time." Ruiz nodded, but there was an unspoken weight to her response. They both knew how often by the book meant something different for people of color. Justice, though promised to be blind, often peeked beneath its blindfold when race was involved. As the last officer closed the door of the squad car, Ruiz turned back to Darius. "He didn't even know who you were." Darius smiled bitterly. "It wouldn't have mattered if he did. Men like him don't see rank. They see color." The street was still buzzing, but the tension had shifted. The crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered, discussing the impact of what they had just witnessed. An older Black woman, leaning on her cane, shook her head slowly, her face weathered by years of seeing similar injustices. "It's not over," she said softly to no one in particular. "One arrest doesn't fix the years of pain we've endured, but it's a start." Nearby, a young Latino man, with his phone still raised, nodded in agreement. "People need to see this," he said, showing the video he had recorded to his friend. "This is what happens when we speak out. Maybe, just maybe, things will start to change." For Darius, it wasn't enough to simply make an example out of Mitch. The system was still broken, and one incident wasn't going to repair the years of damage done to communities of color. But in that moment, standing tall amidst the fading sunlight and the murmurs of the crowd, he knew this was a victory, however small. It was a reminder that power, even when abused, wasn't invincible. Hours later, the precinct was quiet, the usual hum of activity subdued by the earlier events. Darius walked through the halls, every eye in the building on him. Some gazes held respect, others discomfort, but all of them carried the weight of the day's events. He stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, letting out a slow breath. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation had finally worn off, and he allowed himself a moment to feel the gravity of what had happened. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lieutenant Ruiz entered, her expression unreadable but serious. "Captain," she began, standing in front of his desk. "Mitch is in holding. He's lawyered up, but there's no doubt he's going down for this. I wanted to ask if you wanted to make a statement. The press is already on this." Darius leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "My statement will be simple, Lieutenant. No one is above the law, not even the ones sworn to uphold it." Ruiz nodded, understanding the significance of his words. "The department will have to answer for this, too. You know that." "I know," Darius replied, his voice steady. "And I'll be here to make sure they do." By the next morning, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, plastering Mitch Donovan's face across television screens and headlines. "Officer arrested for assaulting black police captain in racially charged incident." The country was watching, and so was the world. The incident sparked conversations in homes, workplaces, and especially online. Discussions about racial profiling, police brutality, and systemic racism flooded social media as people debated and dissected the event. For some, it was proof that the system was finally holding officers accountable. For others, it was just another example of the racism embedded in law enforcement. But for Darius, the fight was just beginning. His role as captain wasn't just to lead his precinct, it was to challenge the very system that allowed officers like Mitch to thrive. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but as he watched the city begin to stir with the early morning light, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Months later, the trial of Mitch Donovan had come and gone. The jury found him guilty of assaulting a superior officer, and though his sentence was light compared to the weight of his crime, the message was clear: the badge no longer guaranteed immunity. But the trial was just the beginning. Across the country, protests and discussions continued to grow, fueled by the incident. Darius had become a quiet symbol of hope for many in the city, not because he had brought down a corrupt officer, but because he represented what justice should look like: calm, unwavering, and fair. In a small park near the precinct, a memorial service was held for victims of police violence. Darius stood among the crowd, his presence noted but not announced. He wasn't here as the captain today, he was here as a black man, as a member of the community he had sworn to protect. As he listened to the names being read, he knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was listening. And for Darius, that was enough to keep fighting.